id Software's Quake series has long struck me as a franchise that never really had the strongest sense of identity. Don't get me wrong, when I think back on those games, it's with fond memories, especially of losing whole weekends to multiplayer sessions with my friends. When we got our hands on the first one, we were blown away by the technical progression it represented from id's previous Doom and Wolfenstein titles, and we would often stand back from it between sessions, marvelling at how it surely pointed toward the future of the rapidly evolving first-person shooter genre. Like a lot of people at the time, we wondered where it would take it. Yet, as time wore on, Quake as a franchise sort of confounded us. It certainly went in some interesting directions. The inevitable second game presented itself as a superior sequel with a robust single-player campaign, and after that, Quake III Arena shifted the focus more determinedly onto the series' already strong multiplayer aspect. But even though this trend of continual retooling resulted in a handful of extremely well-received games, they ultimately lacked something id's preceding shooters had: a strong sense of narrative continuity between installments. And so, arguably, the older Doom and Wolfenstein games would leave more of a mark on many players in that respect, despite being less technically accomplished. It's not hard to fathom why. True sequels in gaming are often keenly anticipated. As much as with any form of entertainment, people become invested to some degree in the stories grafted onto these things, and for the longest time, as a franchise, Quake didn't have much of a hook in this regard. Quake II bears absolutely no story connection to the original game, going so far as to trade its gothic visual stylings for a militaristic science fiction setting. And id wouldn't grace the series with an entry serving as a proper continuation of anything that came before until 2005, with Quake IV. Perhaps confusingly, this fourth game's campaign mode plays out as a follow-up to Quake II, arriving roughly 8 years later, long after the release of Quake III Arena, and its only console port would grace the Xbox 360. It's quite an interesting conversion to look at, because it was an early release for the platform, hailing from a time when developers were still feeling their way around the intricacies of bringing such a game to a fairly new system. The bad news is, it really shows. I won't beat around the bush here. Quake IV on the Xbox 360 is a bad port of a decent game. And that's a disappointing state of affairs, because as previously mentioned, if you're specifically looking for a console port of it, this is your only option. I can't remember, and I didn't think to check during my research for this video, if its exclusivity to the 360 was ever intentional by way of an agreement between id and Microsoft, or whether it just proved too painful an ordeal to port it across to other consoles. But if what you see here on screen is anything to go by, I wouldn't be surprised at all if it was a case of the latter, because the game is a technical car crash. I generally prefer not to front-load my reviews with excessive detailed criticism, but in this case I think it's warranted. This version of Quake IV made such a terrible first impression with me that after the first session of my playthrough, I very nearly decided against covering it for the show at all, because it performed so badly as to induce genuine discomfort. If ever you needed a game to demonstrate the benefits of locked frame rates, this is it. Complex environments or encounters with multiple enemies reliably reduce the experience to a slideshow, punctuated by brief moments of smooth emotion when there's not so much on screen for the 360 to deal with. It's all over the place. Usually, I'm not one to get too picky over this kind of thing. Occasional frame drops are an unavoidable fact of life in console games of this era, but I've seen badly made shooters on older hardware that ran better than this, and the effect is so wearying that I actually walked away from my monitor more than once feeling physically fatigued. But for the sake of putting a review together, I persisted. Although, if I'm really honest, it may have had something to do with the fact that prior to this, I'd never played Quake IV in any shape or form, so I was curious to see broadly what it was all about. And I've got to say, looking past the woeful performance, as a direct sequel to the second game, it's kind of interesting. Taking positives where we can here, it at least ponies up a recognisable Quake experience. All the familiar gameplay concepts of the series are here, as well as its roster of weapons. Quake wouldn't be Quake without the rocket launcher, lightning gun and dark matter cannon, so it's reassuring to find them all present and correct. Unlike a lot of modern console shooters, your health doesn't regenerate over time, meaning you have to constantly look out for health and armour pickups. That's a feature of the series I've always personally appreciated, as it adds an element of tension and risk to each enemy engagement. Firefights feel genuinely dangerous when there's a real threat of player death, and you'll find yourself seeking out cover and trying to make your shots count, because you learn very quickly that you can't just soak up enemy fire. You'll also learn that you need to actively go looking for those pickups I mentioned, because although you'll find them laying around in plain sight, exploration reaps rich rewards. Certain doorways or gaps in the scenery lead to rooms where you'll find additional items, and nosing about for these is worthwhile, because besides having a finite amount of health, you're not handed unlimited ammo on tap either, especially for the more powerful weapons you'll eventually acquire. All of this feels very true to HdE'S tried and tested blueprint for the series, but they've broadened its scope for this entry in some interesting ways as well. At certain points, you'll find yourself accompanied by allied soldiers. Besides providing decent support in a firefight, some of these specialise as technicians or medics, so when they're not in combat, walking up to one of them and tapping the designated action button will prompt them to top up your health or armour. That's a neat feature which gives the player another way to stay in the fight besides scouring nooks and crannies for pickups. They're not a passport to easy game progress though. Apart from the fact that you'll only find yourself working with teammates at certain key points in the campaign, they also die fairly easily in combat if you don't watch out for them. So do the right thing and try to keep them alive. A dead medic can't heal anyone. Quake IV stands out in the series for having a stronger sense of narrative than previous games, with use of short cutscenes and some slick in-engine storytelling. That builds to a genuinely neat plot twist about a third of the way into the game, which I'll not heavily spoil here. Suffice to say, your player character undergoes something of a physical transformation, and, refreshingly, it's a development that has a meaningful impact on gameplay, bestowing you with more health, enabling other healing options, and even factoring into the way certain sections play out. Taking this renewed focus on storytelling alongside all the considered tweaks id have made, it's actually quite cool to see how they've thrown some new ideas at their tried and trusted design. It's just a shame that not all of them stick. Sad to say, although there are plenty of interesting ideas in this game, they're not all executed 100% properly. And I'm not sure how much of that comes down to the fact that it's a ropey port. Some issues are inextricably tied to the fact that this is a version of Quake IV that's intended for play on a console. And besides its terrible performance, there are some other shortcomings that betray that. A case in point would be the way you select your weapons. Kind of an important detail for a game like this. But here it's really clunky. You can choose from your selection of amassed weaponry either via the 360 controller's D-pad, which brings up a 4-way tree to navigate through, or by cycling through them with the left and right bumpers, which is what I found myself doing in preference. Honestly though, neither method is ideal. There's a lagginess to the bumper presses that often saw me cycle past the weapon I was trying to select, meaning I'd sometimes have a panicky moment in a firefight where I'd have to awkwardly tap back and forth before equipping the right one. The D-pad method though, I found near unusable, thanks to the way the selection tree works. On that, your weapons are arranged into categories that correspond to each of the pad's 4 axes, and you cycle through each one with repeated presses in any given direction. Where it falls down is that, to swap to a different category, you can't just quickly tap in the relevant direction. You have to navigate back to the centre of the selection tree first, and that's just too fiddly to contend with in the middle of a hectic enemy engagement. It makes me wonder if whoever signed off on this feature had actually played the game with it, because it's awful. Another botched aspect of the game, which is most definitely a part of the package and nothing to do with its translation to console, are its occasional vehicular sections. It often feels to me like the FPS genre went through a phase where these were almost mandatory, getting shoehorned into any given title whether they were a good fit for it or not. And in this case, I don't think I'd miss them if they weren't here. They don't feel especially exciting or innovative. The best I can say about them is that they break up the flow of the campaign, and they never put you in the same vehicle twice, so there is that. The thing with Quake IV is that you can certainly see that id were trying with it. It's got a lot of neat ideas, the core gameplay and storyline are solid, and its campaign is structured with obvious intent to keep the player from getting bored. Level design is great and varied, and a full playthrough clocks in at a respectable length. It's just that not everything in here works, at least not as well as maybe it should in what could be described as a flagship title. Beyond that, any other problems are squarely down to the hardware it's being played on. I'm personally of the opinion that the 7th generation of video game consoles was a pretty exciting one when it came to watching how first-person shooters would evolve on those platforms. I mean, sure, there were some great examples of the genre to be found in the preceding couple of generations, bound as they were by the limitations of that technology. But the step up in power and performance provided by something like the Xbox 360 enabled much grander spectacle and smoother play. At least in theory. Like I said at the outset, the reality is that it takes time for developers to learn how to fully harness the power of new gaming hardware. So early titles to appear in a system's marketable lifespan may not necessarily turn out as well as they conceivably could. And the 360 port of Quake IV serves as a stark reminder of that. Is it playable? Well, yes. If I was able to chew through the full campaign in spite of its technical issues, I expect other folks will be able to as well. And there's a pretty decent game in here if you can look past the wildly erratic frame rate and clumsy weapon selection. But really, why should you? Having the game as an early system exclusive might have been a coup for Microsoft in 2005. The trouble is, time hasn't been kind to it at all. Plenty of games have come along since that do everything Quake IV does and far better. So I honestly wouldn't pick it up in preference to almost any other first-person shooter on the console, especially when you can play something like one of the Halo games that came out for it. I mean, any competently coded multi-platform shooter might be a better bet, and that being the case, I can't really recommend this port as anything other than an interesting curio, or maybe a collection piece for die-hard Quake heads. There is one interesting detail that might make it worth picking up though. The game originally released with a special bonus disc, including a full HD remaster of Quake II. Those discs are honestly quite hard to come by these days, but if you can find one in good condition, that might make the purchase worthwhile. Just be aware that you do need to exercise some caution. The copy I sourced for this review came with the bonus disc, which claimed to contain Quake II and a feature on the making of Quake IV, but neither of the Xbox 360 Elite models I have to hand at totally unoriginal towers would read it, despite the disc being in pristine condition. Ah well, what can you do? So, with that brief consumer advisory warning out of the way, the big question hanging over this port of Quake IV is, should you play it? And the answer is, no, probably not. If you've got a powerful need to play the game, I'd really encourage you to check it out on a PC or Mac if you can, because even if it feels a bit old school in places and some of its ideas don't quite land, it's a decent shooter and it's worth the effort. Just not like this.